Kia ora and welcome to the Niggly Niche Cast. It's the Diggity Doodah Doc, Mr. Pepto Panther, a slipper, here to talk with the Wobbly Wildcard about a couple of different sporting matters. The Wildcard has been all over this New Zealand Breakers situation, so we're just going to get a couple of thoughts from him with regards to what is happening with the Aotearoa Breakers at the moment. A little bit of coming and going and signings and whatnot and drama. Then we're going to flip the focus into some footballing matters. Old mate Sarpreet Singh made his debut for Bayern Munich, and Wildcard, what's crack-a-lackin'?
Oh, I mean, not too much. Planning to pop down the road this evening and have a look at this new Star Wars movie that everyone seems to hate. So I'm very much excited to be able to write about that. Probably from the way I'm anticipating it is the old Game of Thrones finale type thing, where everyone kind of hated the Game of Thrones finale. It was the big old the big narrative was what a disaster of the writing and all this was, and I was sitting there writing well, it's not as bad as you're making it sound. I mean, if you're complaining about the writing was pretty bad. Basically, complete inverse parallel to them going off the books. So I've been saying this for multiple seasons that the writing is getting worse, and I actually quite like the Game of Thrones finale in particular, but a lot of that last season, particularly the first couple episodes. And I suspect that this new Star Wars thing, where people got very hyped up over what was just basically copy and paste from the original trilogy, and now people are going to be like, well, it's not a convincing finish. What is this? It's betrayed every. Well, you get excited about something that was never up to much in the first place. I'm quite enjoying that parallel. At least, maybe it'll be a brilliant movie when I see it, and that won't be the case. I don't know.
Fun fact, I have not watched anything Star Wars related in at least 10 years. I just don't care at all. So I don't know why. It's just one of those things where they just keep coming out with different spins on the same thing. I have heard about that Mandalorian show that...
little baby Yoda.
Yeah, that's tickling my taste buds just hearing about it, so I might pop into that. But
it's not that good.
Definitely pay no attention to Star Wars, so I couldn't give a shit about Star Wars. What I do give a shit about Wildcard, just to spark us off here, is some UFC stuff, because on the weekend, Alex Volkanovski, who was an Australian fighter, he defeated Max Holloway in a title bout. Now, Volkanovski has a full-time Australian coach, but he spends a lot of time at City Kickboxing. City Kickboxing now have two champions. They got Israel Adesanya and Alex Volkanovski, and a very knowledgeable, respected kind of personality talking about MMA and fighting is Luke Thomas, and he has broken down a few times the City Kickboxing way. He's done multiple analyses on Israel Adesanya. He did a preview of Volkanovski's striking before the fight. Then he broke it down after the fight. And then he managed to get Eugene Bareman online to talk through some stuff that happened against Max Holloway. Max Holloway is pretty much known as the best ever in his division, and still is. Volkanovski is going to have to deal with a rematch against Holloway. But this is just a very simple note that I found interesting, because it goes to some great length to describe the detail and the know-how of Eugene Bareman and the other coaches at City Kickboxing, because Max Holloway appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience today after the fight, and Joe Rogan, who was commentating the fight, was talking about all the leg kicks that Volkanovski was doing to Max Holloway, and they were discussing it as though there was a tactic to beat up the leg of Holloway and to get points to win a decision later on. You just keep striking that leg, you're going to point it up, and you're going to possibly force Holloway to switch stances, and then you can go about your work. What Eugene Bareman said, though, to Luke Thomas was that they had noted many things about Holloway. Holloway's got plenty of tape, so if you put in the effort, you're going to see anyone's strengths and weaknesses in that game. And Max Holloway was very proficient at controlling distance, and he did so by having a slightly wider stance and his front leg forward, but then his head would be over the top of his front leg, or his lead shoulder would be over the top of his front leg. And when that happens, you're dictating the distance because you're gaining X amount of space on your opponent in a very kind of mysterious, low-key way, so then you can control the distance. If you're controlling the distance, you're basically controlling the fight. So what Eugene Bareman said was that they attacked the leg to move Holloway's center of gravity back 2 to 3 inches and put him in a foreign position where he has to try and strike Volkanovski from just slightly out of that distance, and that would impact Holloway because he hasn't really fought too much from there. Like, his opponents haven't dictated the fight that much with that insight and put that much pressure on Holloway before. So that just shows you it's one very small example. Like, I reckon anyone fighting from City Kickboxing has multiple layers to their game plan, which was definitely the case for Volkanovski. But it just shows you there's a very simple kind of message or simple plan that is the perceived plan. But what I have learned through Luke Thomas's analysis and listening and soaking up information about City Kickboxing is that everything they do is so detailed and so forward thinking that there's so many, like, this leads to this fake leads to this, and this setup leads to this, and then you can do this, and then we can do this, and then we can do this. And so I just find that a very interesting, simple example of how smart and just dominant City Kickboxing has been, and that is based on their coaching, that is based on their homework, and how they break down fights. And another thing just on that is that they were aiming to take strengths away from Max Holloway. So you don't necessarily target a weakness, you target a strength, and you take that strength away from your opponent, and then that is kind of the same as exposing a weakness, because you're putting your opponent in a difficult position because they can't use the same tools they've used throughout their career.
Mate, levels, like the levels to it. It's basically chess, like with the old like feints, like the idea you move this guy into check, and then suddenly they're thinking, okay, this bishop's coming for my king. What am I going to do here? I'll respond here. It's closing out the bishop, and then this other fella's like, nah, mate, I'm like 3 steps ahead. This was just the first move. What I'm actually doing is this. Boom, 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 checkmate, sort of thing. Like, that's to be able to think at those, like, that depth and those levels is crazy. I love that kind of thing when you get that, like, even just that level of analysis afterwards as well about a fight, about a sporting event, anything like that. Like, the tactical side of things, I'm always so fascinated by that, and by the people that are able to, like, be successful at finding those little, like, areas that they can expose and affect the outcome like that. And
I think it's a rather compelling case that Eugene Bareman is like the coach of the year in 2019 for Aotearoa.
Oh, I don't know. Steve Hansen made it to a Rugby World Cup semi-final.
Oh, challenging. Challenging indeed. I'm going to lean towards Eugene Bareman on that one, wildcard.
Yeah, he might just get the toss of the coin in that situation, eh?
I mean, making it to a semi-final is reason to be fired as All Blacks coach.
I wonder if he would have been if he hadn't already said he was leaving. I actually think, I mean, we're not going to talk about rugby now, but I think the All Blacks buggered that up pretty badly, and I think they've probably buggered up the old, the next coaching appointment as well. I don't see how that wasn't just perfect opportunity to to get some fresh blood and take it into a new era, but instead let's just continue the stuff that was already getting stale beforehand. Yeah, nah, never mind. Typical New Zealand rugby, of course.
And as you would expect, All Blacks coaching insights and information and breakdowns is happening in December. It's leading all news, is the All Blacks coaching shit. That is why the niche case exists. That is why we are doing what we do, and that tells you about the basic know-how of the Kiwi media landscape, is that the All Blacks coaching stuff is still leading the news in Aotearoa in December, when we have an absolute smorgasbord of sporting stuff to enjoy. And I don't know, you might be enjoying this, because I think you might be like vindicated. You are well ahead of the curve in discussing the Aotearoa Breakers. You're well ahead of the curve in catching a vibe from the Breakers. You basically laid it all out for everyone to see, that there was a slightly fishy smell from the Breakers, and I don't like it. Just, we had the Glenn Rice stuff that popped up that also vindicated the vibe, and then there's just things have escalated kind of behind the scenes as well. So just talk to me about the Breakers and where they're at, and hopefully we can educate some of the listeners on just where the Breakers are sitting right now, considering we've been on this little journey and assessing a bit of a downward spiral.
Yeah, I mean, they've been real hard to write about recently because it's just been the same kind of thing. Like, there's no consistency. They've lost all 6 away games, and I think they've lost their last 4 of those by double digits. Like, and if that's the case, like, they play Southeast Melbourne at home on Friday night. After that, they have 5 straight away games. They're already 4-10, so it's already like, it's not like they're winning everything at home in order to balance that out. They're 4-4 at home. With more away games coming up than home games for the rest of the schedule, needing to at least reverse their current standings to be able to even have a shot at the playoffs, which realistically they're just not going to do, because they haven't shown anywhere near the level of consistency and dependable basketball and these kind of things. It's been like, there's some good games. The win against Brisbane Bullets at home 2 games ago was fantastic, and that was directly after probably their worst performance of the whole season, with the game where Glenn Rice came back and took 26 shots in 30 minutes, and everyone else just basically had to sit and watch the Glenn Rice show, who had 1 training session since being unsuspended, and no sooner had he got back in the rhythm of playing basketball again than he was on his bike, because he'd broke his curfew and got cut by the team, and like, that whole thing was just a disaster waiting to happen, and literally everybody told them, is the crazy thing. But that's why this latest week has been such a funky one, because Glenn Rice situation was only ever not excusable, understandable, I'll say. The only possible logic behind that was that he could help you win basketball games. Everything else was just a massive risk, but he could help you win basketball games because he's a great player, which means, like, clearly that was just filling up the old, just falling in line with the extremely win now kind of situation the Breakers have been trying to put themselves in throughout this season, and like, that's changed extremely drastically and suddenly this last week, where they've gone in the complete other direction. Corey Webster's been allowed a buyout to go to China for the rest of this season. He'll be back in April, and he's actually I assume this is part in as a reward for him hanging around after he wasn't allowed to go to Turkey at the start of the year and playing some very good basketball as he did. And then his reward back to the Breakers for them, acquiescing this time, is he's signed a 2-year extension after this. So it's pretty fantastic for Corey Webster, really, as he gets to go to China, make a big payday over the next, 4 months, and then he comes back with his make a lot of money to set up his family for the next few years, and then come back to Auckland where he's all settled and, have his long-term future all sorted. So it's pretty ideal for him. However, for the Breakers to let their best local player, maybe their best player, and Scotty Hobson's probably shade above Corey Webster, but those are the two guys who have been mostly dominating the show. Also, part of the reason they haven't been doing well is that they've both been out injured recently. And yeah, to let him go at this stage of the season, though, at the halfway point, it's a pretty significant shift. Like, it's a complete 180 from the kind of decisions they were making beforehand. But to be honest, I don't mind it, because it's an acknowledgement that this season hasn't worked out the way they wanted it to, and they are actually now focusing on a future which up until now they've pretty much sacrificed completely. Like, think of a development guy who's come up. He was was he sixth man of the year or was he most improved? I forget, but Shea Ely won one of those awards a couple seasons ago. He left at the start of this season because RJ Hampton was coming in for 1 year and he just wasn't going to get the minutes. So, like, you've chased out a guy who could have been a one-club player in the same way as Tom Abercrombie in the NBL for the Breakers, at the expense of a guy who was only ever going to be there for one season, who was a 18-year-old, bringing all this other potential distractions kind of thing. I don't know, he's been overly distracting. They are filming a documentary behind the scenes, apparently, on the RJ Hampton experience, but like to then now be suddenly just shifting towards, we're going to plan for the future now, where the future beforehand, it seemed like they had absolutely no concept of what the future meant. I don't mind that. I think it's a surprisingly pragmatic move from the Breakers, but it does put a lot of what's been going on throughout the season in a different perspective, because it's admitting that it all failed effectively, because they made all these moves to win now at the expense of more or less everything else, and like they haven't been winning. And now only halfway through the season, they've let one of their most reliable scorers go and accepted that it's just not going to happen. Which, I can't say I saw that one coming, but it's probably not the dumbest thing they've done this season, which it's probably not even in the top 10 dumbest things they've done this season.
So, to me, the wishy-washy nature of the organization feels like the biggest issue. There are other issues, for sure, but they are more detailed, more nuanced, and just smaller. Is that wishy-washy nature of we don't... Like, on the one hand, it's crystal clear. They started out, and as you said, they were in win-now mode, and they were big and expansive, and they wanted to, blow up the brand and bring all these people from America watching the Breakers and all that shit. So on the one hand, that's a clear message, and then now they've changed, and apparently it's a clear message as well. But I think if you just slip beneath that surface, extremely wishy-washy.
Yeah, it probably is, and I gotta be careful what I say so I don't get litigated. But I suspect, and I don't mean this in a bad way or a criticism of the person or anything like this, but I do wonder how many people in this organization have the authority to say no to Matt Walsh. And because that sort of is what it feels like. One guy's making all these decisions, which means you're at the whim of like one person, and where you have more of a leadership group making these calls and deciding on the direction of the franchise and all these kind of things. And maybe they will feel that this is the way, but I wonder if people actually, like, in reality are comfortable with saying, no, that's a dumb idea, let's do this instead. Like, I assume Dan Shamir's got a fair say in terms of playing group, because a lot of, like, most of the imports they've had this season have been guys who he's worked with, been familiar with before from Israel. Sick Henry, Glenn Rice, Scotty Hobson, all been around there before. So I suspect that's part of the thing. But I also suspect that one of the main reasons Dylan Boucher left was because you had an owner who, it's on the record that he has a large say in player recruitment and marketing and things like this. Like, I remember that Athletic article, I'm pretty sure, said a lot of that. Like, he has a level of decision making that goes beyond just being, he's the CEO and the owner, so obviously he's going to be the guy who has to ratify everything anyway. But it sort of felt like he was kind of and also facing up to the media the majority of the time, in situations where, like, the general manager should really be the one talking about like player recruitment and stuff, and they have a new general manager now, even though they said they weren't going to hire one at first, that they'll just absorb it from within. And I was like, well, you've already absorbed it from within before Boucher left, so big deal. They did hire a new general manager, a fella who's been around the club for ages. Can't remember his name, probably because I've literally never heard of him again since he did the thing. Like, I haven't seen him do any media stuff or any quotes from him in a press release or anything like that. We'll know if people are listening to this podcast, but whether or not suddenly the next time they do a press release, old mate will pop up with the the first quotes. But like, I just wonder, it's sort of, if like, I'm not saying Matt Walsh is sabotaging anything. I'm not saying he has anything but the best intentions for this club. But if you're the only person, and he's a dude who hasn't run a basketball club before like this, and at any point, he's a pretty young to be in this situation anywhere in the world, really. Own a CEO of a professional sports team. Like, I just wonder if there aren't too many yes men surrounding him, and this is part of why the Breakers haven't shown a lot of consistency in the way they're doing things, other than a consistent desire to win, but a desire to win which hasn't coincided with them building a winning culture or a winning atmosphere around things. Like, they've got rid of a lot of their old leaders. They've got rid of, coaches who have experienced this league before. Like, it's just, the whole thing is not set up to win right now. You've got a head coach who's never coached in this league before and just got his third-year contract extension picked up, which I wrote quite a bit about the other day, because I just don't really understand why halfway through the first year that's a decision you felt you need to make, especially when like injuries and other situations out of his control have meant we don't even know if he's a good coach yet. Like, all the other circumstances just blow that stuff out of the water. We don't have the evidence to make a decision, and obviously from within the organization you have a different view of things, and they must like what Shamir's doing and what he offers, and he was handpicked. But right now he's on target to have a worse season in terms of wins with a better roster than Kevin Braswell did last season. And Kevin Braswell wasn't just sacked, he was made redundant to get rid of him. So, like, clearly it just doesn't look like Shamir is going to be held to the same level of accountability that Braswell was, which is a question in and of itself. And yeah, it just seems like it's a little bit too much at the whim of a single person, like, for better and for worse. Like, there are times when it just removes the clutter or whatever, but we're also talking about an owner who hasn't had a lot of this experience. So regardless of all the best intentions, I suspect that to wrap it up the way I started this bit, I just suspect there aren't enough people in that organization who feel like they can say no to him.
Do you have anything else to add about the Breakers?
I do have a nice hypothetical. I was thinking, like, in my head over recent times, like, which I focused in a way I hadn't focused on before. In the past, like, throughout the season, I've been dropping hints, like, why isn't this a bigger story throughout the mainstream of Kiwi media? And I think we know why it's not. It's because the Breakers are a basketball team. Basketball is treated like a minority sport in this country, often by the sort of establishment figures, which is unfair because it's one of, if not the fastest rising sport in this country. Steven Adams is a household name. Like, basketball should be getting treated, obviously not on a level with rugby and cricket, but on the next tier below. I mean, we're as good at basketball as we are at football, probably much better, actually. And I don't understand why. Well, I mean, yeah, okay. I sort of understand why, but I'm disappointed why it hasn't been more of a major topic, particularly the Kevin Braswell thing, which it just strikes me as one of the most bonkers things I've ever heard. To make a coach redundant and then hire a director of basketball, air quotes, to replace him in order to back up the legal case because he's suing you now for, the money he didn't get from being made redundant rather than being, bought out of his contract or whatever. At least I assume that's what happened. It's all, like I say, it's all murky because no one's really dug into it and got the full story out there in public. But my hypothetical, as I was thinking about that just in a general sense, and then I thought, well, what if it was a different team? And I thought, well, what if the New Zealand Warriors were in this situation, where where a general manager walked out a month out from the thing, assistant coaches quit days out from the first thing, make Stephen Kearney redundant and bring in a guy who's never coached in the NRL before. Let's say hypothetically there's a situation again, like weeks out from the start of the season, where Roger Tuivasa-Sheck turns up in the media and says, well, I've got this massive contract offer to go play with Sonny Bill Williams at the Toronto Wolfpack, and I really want to pursue this. And then they say, no, we're not letting you go. You're too good. You're under contract. And he says, well, why do you know? I can't make the argument that they made about Corey Webster being the statistically the worst starting two guard in the league, because obviously Roger Tuivasa-Sheck's stats are pretty outstanding. But think of like that situation. Then imagine the Warriors coming out and losing losing all but 4 of their first 14 games, sitting like second to last on the table 3 months into the season. Could you imagine the absolute like barnstorm fire, that like the nuclear warfare that would be set off if the Warriors did all of that, let alone midway through that slump hiring a fella with and this sadly isn't nearly as hypothetical as some of those other things. The idea of hiring a rugby league player from the NRL who has had like issues of violence in his past is unfortunately a couple of them. But hiring someone as controversial as that, and then it not working out, and then that person being arrested and ending up in court and then breaking their curfew, like, could you imagine what an absolute, like, just the chaos, they would be disbanded. Like, they would not even exist anymore if that happened. Like, could you even imagine how bad that would be? When the Breakers, comparatively, it's a bit of a narrative that they're, like, you know, not up to what they used to be. Few cultural questions, but it's not a major deal in the same way as it would be for them, you know?
Yeah, I don't know what the point of your hypothetical situation is, but to me...
Different standards.
Well, no, it's just the landscape we're in New Zealand, and that's the whole point, again, why we exist, because there's been such an inept job of covering the major sports in New Zealand. Like, we are in 2019, basketball and football are the most popular sports in New Zealand based on like playing numbers, and they also just happen to be like the biggest sports in the world. So in terms of just covering a broad range of sports, notable sports in New Zealand, that's the landscape we're in. So when you're explaining that, I'm thinking more of it's a great thing, because when stuff like this happens, like
that's our lane, eh?
That's our lane. And it's also, I think it's been prevalent in how I've written about the Black Caps throughout this time, how you've written about the Black Caps as well, and just with just the thing recently where there's no batting cover in the Black Caps squad, or just how bowlers are talked about with regards to Lockie Ferguson, with regards to Kyle Jamieson. Like, there's a certain level of simplicity, which if you're a professional in that industry, your job's not to be simple. Your job is to get into the nitty gritty of these things and come up with a interesting perspective on what is happening. So yeah, when you describe that, I'm just thinking hurrah, because for you as someone who has put your neck out and outlined a couple of things with the Breakers, like for us, that's fantastic. Like, we thrive on how basically shit the mainstream media is in New Zealand. So I just kind of see it as a beautiful thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a nice opportunity for us, eh? It's nice to give us a bit of room to do our thing, and that's also a nice angle that we often have to be able to lean on, is that we're covering stuff that people aren't, and why aren't they covering it, and, you know, etc. I'll say also with the terms of the Black Caps, it's and I know you know this, like it's also not just simplicity, it's also chumminess, and, you know, not wanting to upset people and ruin your leads and stuff like that. The Breakers, I don't know if they're in that situation. I think it's more the Breakers just playing the game and being a little sneaky with how they do things. Like, the Corey Webster news came a day, I think, after they announced that Dan Shamir's contract had been picked up, and made a big deal about the continuity and the structures, how they're planning for the future and all this. And then the next thing is they let their star player go and signal the end of this season, basically. So they're a little bit different in terms of, I don't think anyone's just trying to be nice to the Breakers. I think it's just that people are not as bothered about the Breakers and have let them get off easy, to be honest. That, like, compared to what other sports teams would have to deal with, a Super Rugby team even would be savaged for half the stuff the Breakers have done this season. In fact, I've seen Super Rugby teams get savaged for a lot less. So, I don't know.
I think the Breakers are taking advantage of what we're talking about. It's not like...
I think that's probably true as well. I mean, look at the crowd numbers are fantastic. That's one thing you can't argue about. So clearly, somehow, like, there's a lot of people who either the message isn't getting through or they just don't care, and that's fine. Like, whatever, they each to their own sort of thing. It's up to anybody what they are willing to put up with in a team they support. But yeah, crowd numbers have been fantastic for the Breakers, and I sort of expected them to drop after the first couple games, but they haven't yet. They might now over the second half of the season, but
I'm talking more in terms of like manipulation of the mainstream media who don't do a good job anyway.
That has happened.
So the Breakers know there are certain things they can get away with. They know that there's a way of conducting their media business that is going to cause the least damage. And when you're doing that in an environment where the perception is that no one cares about basketball because everyone in New Zealand cares about rugby, you can go about your business in a certain way where you're just wiggling through without having to really deal with issues. But to do that, you need to be manipulating the mainstream media, which is exactly how I perceive what you laid out there.
Yeah, that's definitely happened, and I don't really want to go into specifics and throw things out there, but I'll just say that has definitely happened. It's also, what was I going to say? It's also a case with them, I think, a little bit of, the one time it did get away with them was with the Glenn Rice situation. Like, that was the one time it got out of their control. But I think other than that little window, which is closed now because he's no longer on the roster and any opportunity of playing, and therefore he's out of the eyes. You know, he's still, I assume, in New Zealand because he has court dates and stuff like that. But they can do that all far away from prying eyes. So, other than that little window, I think, despite all the dramas they've had to sort of try to cover up and hide, and I mean, I will say a very good example of this was Glenn Rice initially getting arrested. Happened supposedly on a Wednesday night, Thursday morning. By the time the news came out, it was like Friday afternoon here, and he was already not just on a plane, he was already in Perth with the team, far away from any of this, and expecting to play in that game that they had at the weekend in Perth. And like, obviously that whole thing ended up being a disaster of a away trip, because it wasn't just Glenn Rice as well. There was the stuff on the plane on the way back, but like, they clearly buried that up to a couple days, and I'm pretty, like, not just disappointed, it's inconceivable to me how a situation like that never made its way onto the TV news otherwise. Like, if you get punched by a basketball player, especially a big American basketball player, I would have thought someone like that would automatically, like, hey, News Hub, what do you reckon, sort of thing. Like, I'm stunned that no one found out, or even just a tweet that someone picked up on. I'm stunned that no one found out about that properly until a couple of days later. But it's a good example of them sort of, you know, playing the game a little bit and just taking advantage of the slightly cozy landscape that they have as not quite a minority sport, but definitely a couple steps below a majority sport in terms of how they're covered, which is not in proportion to, you know, how they're supported or how the sport that they play is supported in this country.
To some better news, old Sarpreet Singh made his debut for Bayern Munich. There was this almost happened a week or so ago. Everyone was kind of on the edge of their seats, and then it snuck up for him to actually make his debut, and seeing Sarpreet Singh replace Philippe Coutinho, pretty ridiculous. How not just like how did Sarpreet Singh go in his debut, but how's the general... You kind of gave us that update a week ago, so I don't imagine too much has changed in terms of Sarpreet Singh's general standing at Bayern Munich.
Nah, not really. It's still all just him taking steady steps forward in his progress. He was on the bench again this morning, and in a, I think no, it wasn't a cup game. That was the other one. In a game against, I think it was Freiburg. And yeah, again, third game in a row that he's been on the bench for them. It helps that there's a lot of midweek games at the moment, and there's still in Germany about a week or two, like maybe 2 or 3 games away from their winter break, which is a month-long thing, which basically they don't play in all of January because it's just too snowy and not worth it. Teams tend to go on German teams will go on like a little what do you call it, like little training camp or something like that, and well, it's Bayern Munich, so probably to bloody UAE or something like that, or maybe Ibiza or something, I don't know. But yeah, a lot of games coming up, few injuries at the moment in the squad. It's aligned nicely with also still having it's likely that they'll appoint a new permanent manager, I think, during that winter break. So up until that point, they still got the caretaker, who I think, I should know this, but I think he's also got a role at the club as one of the heavily involved in player development and stuff like that. So he's a guy who already had an eye on guys like Sarpreet and guys like Josh Zirkzee, who scored the winner off the bench, who's a couple years younger than Sarpreet actually, but has been in the academy for a little longer than him. Yeah, just all sort of aligns nicely for him to get a good run of, he's been training with the first team all of this month. He's got now 3 games in a row sitting on the bench. He's not going to play most of those. Didn't play this morning, didn't play in that Champions League game. Got 8 minutes off the bench against Werder Bremen, which is quite a cool little coincidence there, because of course the only other New Zealander to ever play in the Bundesliga, in the top flight in Germany, is Winston Rufer. And who did Winston Rufer play for in the Bundesliga? It was Werder Bremen. So and also Winston Rufer, I'm pretty sure Sarpreet Singh had a lot to do with his winners' soccer schools back in the day, which sort of ended up with a bit of a symbiotic thing with the Phoenix Academy and also Only Hunger Sports. And so Sarpreet Singh's had, Winston Rufer rather, has had a fairly significant role in Sarpreet Singh's journey. So to make his debut for the team against the club that Winston used to play for is pretty beautiful, really. And he only played 8 minutes. He got about 5 touches in that time. They were 6-1 up at the time, so it didn't matter. It was just very much garbage time. But again, just a nice little natural progression. Sarpreet doing what it takes to be noticed, making sure he keeps himself around, and just making really steady progress. Not little fluky stuff where you get an opportunity out of the blue. These are all, he's doing it one step at a time in the right progression, in a way where he is set up to continue just pushing for more opportunities in whatever form that happens to be.
Who is your favourite flying Kiwi at the moment, right now, midweek? 19th of December 2019, other than Sarpreet Singh?
Well, I might have to play very much straight down the ground here to this one, because I think it's probably going to have to be a certain Christopher Grantwood, I believe. I think is his name. Let me whip up the things, because I did an Instagram thing the other day running through some stats in recent times, because he scored the winner against Newcastle on the weekend in what was one of the worst games of football all season. The two teams with the lowest possession stakes in the Premier League this year, neither did freezing conditions at Turf Moor. No one really had the creativity to go out there and win that game, but Chris Wood was the guy who they won a slightly fortunate corner. I think it was the right decision. He had won it himself, gave a bit of a shove in the back to a guy. Steve Bruce afterwards was arguing that Newcastle should have had a goal kick because he touched the ball. The fella touched the ball after it went out, which was not true. Replays made that very conclusive. But anyway, that is Chris Wood's. They won 1-0. That is his header at the back post from about 15 centimeters off the line, a beautiful ball from Ashley Westwood, and probably pretty bad goalkeeping and marking, but how are you going to stop the Woodsman in that situation, eh? He has scored 7 times in his last 10 Premier League games now. He has 15 league goals in the calendar year of 2019, and going back to the start of last season, there's not a single player in the Premier League who has scored more headers than Chris Wood. He has 10 of them.
How is the kind of holiday schedule looking for most of these flying Kiwis? Obviously, the Premier League keeps going. We're still going to have a league. Is there a couple? So there's a couple of questions here. Is there a break in the Premiership? And I imagine a lot of the European countries also take a break for a week or two over this period as well. So we just break it down on not necessarily who, but what leagues you're going to be tuning into, for example, over the festive season, just to stay in touch with the Kiwi footballing matters. Not necessarily Flying Kiwis, but local A-League and stuff like that. Just tell the people what football leagues you're going to be paying attention to with regards to Kiwi footballing action over the festive period.
So traditionally, the Premier League doesn't slow down. It actually ramps up over this time. You got Boxing Day fixtures, you got New Year's fixtures, you got stuff like every weekend leading up to and around Christmas and on through. Like, they don't stop at all. They're full steam ahead. So Chris Wood's going to get a lot of games in a short amount of time to be able to keep adding goals to his tally. Other than that, most leagues do take a little bit of a break around this time. Obviously the A-League doesn't, the W League doesn't, but so Phoenix will keep going. Rebecca Stott and Annalie Longo at the two Melbourne clubs in the W League, they'll keep going. The women's stuff in England does break though until about the second week of January, and that's a very similar story, and they're on break now. It's a very similar story to the local premiership, which has games this weekend. And then it's about 3 weeks off, so a bit of a break over the holidays there for them, over Christmas, New Year period. And first week back, you'll be able to tell which teams lived it up, had a few too many extra bites of the Christmas turkey over that time, a few too many potatoes. Most of the European stuff as well, like Bayern Munich go on, like I said, a couple more games, and then they have a month off. The women's stuff in the Bundesliga, which has 4 New Zealanders involved, already is on a break. Most of them are pretty much going into that kind of mode around this time, at least for 2 weeks. Some of them for, if it's countries where it really snows down, then you get even longer of a period. I'm not actually sure. I haven't looked up how Holland do these things. So Ryan Thomas might be able to keep churning out a few games and holding the fort, because tell you what, Flying Kiwis is going to get rather slim pickings pretty soon with it's just Chris Wood and the women playing in Aussie pretty much. And of course the National Women's League here finished last weekend with the grand final.
You can take us anywhere you want to now. Do you want to touch on the women's? Do you want to go to the Phoenix? However you want to wrap this up, wrap it up.
Well, the Phoenix can wait till next week, I think, because we're a little over time. But I should say a few words on the National Women's Grand Final, which happened on the weekend. Canterbury Pride hosting Northern Lights. I did a little bit of a preview leading into it last week, and it was clearly the two best teams throughout the season. Canterbury had beaten every other team every other time they've played them, but they couldn't get past Northern twice during the regular season, including losing at home back in October. They took the lead in a little bit after halftime. It was very much a sort of New Zealand Football Cup final type thing, where you had just a couple of very excellent defensive units just kind of running the play and dominating things there. But Canterbury did take the lead through, I think it's Nikola Dominikovic, and then pretty soon after that, Callie Brown scored a blinder of a goal for Northern to tie it up. But it went through into extra time at 1-1, and neither team really had the energy at that point. It had been a pretty exhausting game. Just two teams really throwing everything they could, but cancelling each other out, and then not a lot of opportunities. Very much a grinding, feeling the occasion, kind of game. And a few minutes into extra time, it was pretty obvious this thing was heading through to penalties. So, the Canterbury Pride were able to take that 1-4-2 on the spot kicks. There was a little bit of controversy in that after Chloe Knott had missed for Northern, I think it's Laura Dabner stepped up to take her penalty, which would have made it 3-1. She missed it, but it was ruled that the keeper had come off the line a little early, so reminiscent of the under-20 men at their World Cup, where Michael Vowd had the same thing happen to him. Didn't really get a good replay of it from the tally coverage, so I couldn't really say whether it was a good call or not. You'd assume, there's an assistant ref on the line looking for that exact thing, so you'd assume there's nothing controversial about it. But Dabner then scored the penalty on the second attempt, a much better effort, and then Canterbury Pride went on to win that one. So they win their 5th National Women's League Championship in 7 years. They've made all 7 of those grand finals, so pretty much a dynasty. In fact, that's not even up for debate. That's a dead set dynasty, one of the more dominant sporting teams in any of our domestic provincial tournaments in any sport around the country, and they're just continuing on the same way. It's a great mix of youth and experience that they have in there, with a few players who've been there for many of those, and also a couple youngsters coming through. It was about, both teams had multiple players from that under-17 World Cup last year as well, so always beautiful to see the very best teams giving opportunities to the very best young players coming through. And yeah, Canterbury Pride did it again.
Shout out to the old Cantabs.
They know how to make a winning sports team down there, don't they?
I just think their women's cricket team isn't doing too well. Just off the top of my head in the old 2020 competition, Women's Super Smash.
Yeah, cricket's been a bit of a downer for them lately. But
I will... I am just going to talk about the Super Smash a little bit here, Wildcat, if you don't mind, because the Canterbury Magicians have lost all 3 games, so not too amazing there. The Women's Super Smash, quite interesting because all the big dogs have come back. So you got all the Women's Big Bash League players are coming back. However, the leading bowler is Deanna Doughty, who has 7 wickets at an average of 10. She's a leg spinner from Wellington. Wellington also have Amelia Kerr, the best leg spinner in Aotearoa, and Lee Kasperick, the best off spinner in Aotearoa. And Deanna Doughty is leading all wicket takers with her leg spin. I think she did that last season as well. And I just wrote today about Caitlin Gurry, who is part of the Northern Districts women's team. Northern Districts have 2 wins, 1 loss. Wellington and Auckland are undefeated after 3 games. Caitlin Gurry has scored 2 half-centuries and a century in 3 innings, which is pretty damn impressive, Wildcat, if you ask me. And she was the leading run scorer in last year's 2020 competition, I think, or second in runs to Frances Mackay, something like that. And I believe she was also doing pretty well in the one-day competition. I'll just pull this up quickly because I wasn't thinking about talking about this, but she is in astronomical form. She made her White Ferns debut in T20 cricket last summer. So she's played 3 games of T20 cricket in this competition, the Super Smash, and she has 3 50-plus scores, 1 century, 2 half-centuries. In the one-day competition that was before the Super Smash, she played 6 games, and she had 5 50-plus scores, 2 centuries, 3 half-centuries. So that is a total of 9 innings and 8 50-plus scores.
Outstanding.
9 innings across Super Smash and one-day cricket, and 8 innings of 50-plus. So Caitlin Gurry is dominating women's cricket. Obviously, having Susie Bates back is great. She's hit a century and a half-century in her 4 games. And there's a fair bit of talent throughout the Women's Super Smash. So I am doing Super Smash diaries rather frequently. It's a bit tricky because the men's Super Smash is coming hard and fast with pretty much a game every day. And then the Women's Super Smash, because Aotearoa is a bit behind the 8 ball in terms of equality and just treating women the same as men, the Women's Super Smash is kind of restricted to weekends and a bit more over the holiday period. So there's a disparity between like the games being played. So just kind of doing a frequent diary every couple of days just to touch base with who is doing what in the Super Smash. And at the moment, Deanna Doughty's leading the wicket takers, and Caitlin Gurry is in ridiculous form.
Yeah, you'd think they would try to organise it all to just like double headers over and over and over again, wouldn't you? But I would have thought that would make more sense, and then you can get some stuff on TV as well. The cameras are already there, and yeah, nah, apparently not.
And it's weird because they've made such a big deal in having the women's Super Smash, like it's the Dream 11 Super Smash for the woman. So it's packaged as a equal product as the men, but it's not being treated that way. So I don't know. I'm just always on this kind of tip, you could say, because only because, well, not only, like we're always pushing for equality and stuff like that, but it's weirder when these organizations like New Zealand Cricket or even the media organizations celebrate moves that are definitely moving towards equality, but also show like how far you have to go. So I'm celebrating when everything is set up in a fairly reasonably equal standing.
Well, that's sort of like what happened in the Women's Super League in England with the football coming off the back of a Women's World Cup. And then because it started about a week before the Premier League, they had access to a lot of the Premier League stadiums, so they played a lot of games in Premier League stadiums for that opening weekend, and there were massive crowds. And then England played Germany in one of the first international windows a month or so ago, maybe a little longer. And they sold out Wembley Stadium for a women's international, which is far and away the biggest crowd they've ever had. But all anyone would talk about was the crowds, and the crowds is a major story. But at some point, it was like, well, can we talk about the football as well? This is not me saying this. This is me reflecting upon what journalists who cover this competition and the English national women's team on the regular being like, yeah, it's cool, it's real good, positive vibrations, and everyone's feeling cool. The crowds are turning up and everything, but also take the sport seriously too is the next step. And there's a lot of people who do a lot of great stuff on that line, but when it does penetrate the wider media landscape, it tends to be similar. And I think we see that in New Zealand a lot, where there's you get a lot of articles about people being like, yeah, they're putting their resources into the women's side of things, and it's so much better. Look at us working towards equality. And it's but then you ignore it at every other point. Unless it's a thing you can fit into this, a lot of them just ignore it. I don't see anyone talking about women's Super Smash leading the headlines at any point in the way that the men's stuff does. Disappointingly, but also I guess it takes a while longer for progress to happen than people often expect or deserve.
And we don't have to look far for a good example, because the Women's Big Bash League stands alone. And I was fuck it, there's no rules around here. I think it was Elise Perry. I listened to a podcast with Elise Perry. She went on the Mark Howard podcast that I've talked about in our cricket discussions. I think it was Elise Perry, perhaps Meg Lanning. And they were saying that their goal is just to make the Women's Big Bash League a standalone commercial product. So instead of having to rely on the money being generated from male sports to fund the female sports, you make your female sporting product just a commercially viable, standalone, sustainable product. And you look at the Women's Big Bash League now, it's fantastic. There's massive crowds, there's good cricket played. It's just a thing. It's separate from the Big Bash because scheduling wise, but also in terms of the product. It's women's cricket. That's difference between men's and women's sport, but it's not a bad thing. It's just for me, it's just something different to enjoy. There are different challenges.
There's difference between the New Zealand Premiership and the English Premier League as well. It doesn't mean you can't enjoy both styles of football.
Exactly. Some things I might like better. There's different skills involved. There's different little tricks of the trade that you have to know. So that is what we can aim for. Not we, because we're doing a fucking good job ourselves, but that's what the Super Smash can aim for. It just feels like there's a long way to go before anyone's really willing to go hard in that route, because at the moment it's still being like just pushed to the side, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of celebrating it and then just pushing it to the side and giving it like a sprinkling of attention, a sprinkling of love and appreciation, which just seems like a weird little situation.
And when you look at like Sky Sports, for example, who do a lot of very good stuff and exploring, like, and just in recent times, like expanding their coverage of women's sports in this country, it tends to also come with like a pretty hefty, like, patting themselves on the back kind of thing, which is like, it's not quite the same if you're applauding yourself for doing something you should have been doing in the first place and making that the whole point. It's like, we think women's sports should be covered equally, so we're doing it. Look how great we are, you know? Like, we'll just do it and let the product stand for itself, because that's what we're trying to get to.
Definitely. We'll wrap it up there. Wildcard will be back probably before this next Black Caps test versus Australia on Boxing Day, with a little preview of that. And we'll see what else pops up early next week with regards to podcasts. Otherwise, tune into the Super Smash Diaries. Tune into the Football Breakers writing on the website, and just stay beautiful. Kia kaha, cha. Thank you very much for listening. Remember, you can support the Niche Cage on Patreon, or just listening, liking, commenting, subscribing, and all that shit is beautiful as well. Cha.